Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Today's episode is titled, Why is it considered unreasonable to ask for communication from people? I've started to notice a pattern that is difficult to ignore, and the more I sit with it, the clearer it becomes that this is not just a one-off issue, but something that keeps showing up in different situations. There seems to be a recurring assumption that I am being unreasonable for expecting basic communication, and that assumption alone is what makes this whole situation so frustrating. That expectation, however, is not excessive, not extreme, and not something out of the ordinary. It is a simple request grounded in clarity, mutual respect, and basic human interaction. At some point, asking someone to communicate what is going on has been reframed into something much bigger than it actually is, and that shift does not make much sense when you really break it down. I'm not asking for long explanations, constant updates, or overly detailed breakdowns of every thought or feeling. I'm asking for consistency, awareness, and a basic level of responsiveness that should come naturally in any interaction where both sides actually care. In practical terms, that means keeping someone informed and acknowledging communication when it happens, which is about as basic as it gets. Despite how straightforward that is, it is often met with hesitation, avoidance, or even pushback, and in some cases it is treated as if it requires a significant amount of effort. That disconnect is what stands out the most because it turns something simple into something unnecessarily complicated. It raises a reasonable question about why basic, two-sided communication sometimes feels so difficult for people to maintain. In a balanced interaction, communication should not feel forced or one-sided. It should happen naturally as part of mutual engagement where both people contribute without being chased or reminded. When both people are invested, responsiveness tends to follow without repeated prompts or reminders, and it becomes something you do without even thinking about it. The need to consistently ask, remind, or even push for communication suggests that something is off, and it points to an imbalance in effort that becomes more noticeable the longer it continues. Over time, that imbalance starts to affect the entire dynamic. When one person is regularly initiating contact, following up, or trying to keep the conversation going, the interaction begins to feel one-sided in a way that is hard to ignore. That is not sustainable in the long run, because it shifts the dynamic from mutual participation to one person carrying the weight of the interaction. Clear communication is not an advanced skill reserved for complex situations or emotionally intense conversations. It is a basic expectation that supports trust, consistency, and reliability in any kind of relationship, whether it is personal, social, or professional. Without it, misunderstandings increase, assumptions fill in the gaps, and confidence in the interaction starts to erode over time. What complicates things even further is when the lack of communication is reframed in a way that makes the expectation itself seem like the problem. Instead of acknowledging the gap, responsibility is sometimes shifted in a way that makes a reasonable request appear excessive or unnecessary. That shift creates confusion because it changes the focus from what is actually happening to how the situation is being interpreted. It can make someone question whether their expectations were valid, even when they are grounded in something as simple as wanting clear communication. However, expecting basic communication remains entirely reasonable regardless of how it is framed by others. In some cases, this dynamic resembles a form of deflection where a valid concern is minimized rather than addressed directly. Instead of engaging with the issue, the focus is redirected in a way that avoids accountability. That does not resolve anything. It just delays the problem and often makes it worse over time. There's also an element of convenience that cannot be ignored, because some individuals appear to engage only when it suits them. Communication happens on their terms, at their pace, and according to their preferences without much regard for consistency or mutual effort. When it is convenient, they respond or engage without hesitation, but when it is not, communication stops without explanation, context, or acknowledgement. Then, at some later point, it resumes as if nothing happened, which creates a cycle of inconsistency that is difficult to rely on. This pattern places the burden on the other person to adjust, accommodate, and accept that inconsistency without question. Occasional delays or missed messages are completely understandable and part of normal life, but a repeated pattern of inconsistency is something different entirely. It signals a deeper issue that goes beyond timing or availability and points to a lack of consistent effort. When this becomes the norm rather than the exception, it starts to define the interaction itself. It suggests that the interaction is not being treated with equal importance by both sides, which is something that becomes increasingly clear over time. That realization can be disappointing, but it is also necessary because it provides clarity about what is actually happening. It helps define the nature of the interaction and sets realistic expectations for how it will continue moving forward. Communication is a shared responsibility, and it requires participation from everyone involved, not just one side carrying the entire process. When one side consistently falls short of even minimal expectations, the imbalance becomes clear in a way that cannot be ignored. At that point, the issue is no longer just about communication itself. It becomes a matter of respect, reliability, and whether both people are aligned in how they approach the interaction. Not everyone will meet these standards, and that is a reality that has to be acknowledged without overcomplicating it. Some people will continue to operate in ways that prioritize convenience over consistency, and they may not see an issue with that approach. Others may avoid communication altogether when it requires effort, even if that effort is minimal. Recognizing that does not mean lowering expectations or accepting less than what is reasonable. It means being more intentional about where time and energy are invested, and choosing to engage in interactions that reflect mutual effort and respect. It means understanding that not every situation will meet that standard, and adjusting accordingly without overextending or overcompensating. In the end, expecting clear and basic communication is not unreasonable, excessive, or unrealistic. It is a reasonable standard that supports any functional interaction, and it remains valid regardless of how others choose to respond to it. This concludes this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Thank you for listening. Signing out. Goodbye for now.